University.
Hi, I'm Jed Lavery. I'm a senior at Duke majoring in political science, and today I'll be conducting a discussion with Professors Dan Ariely and Kathy Davidson on self-control. Kathy Davidson is the Ruth F. DeVarney Professor of English and the John Hope Franklin Institute Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies. And Dan is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics. We are here today for our open course, Surprise Endings, which is Duke's first MOOC, or Massive Online Open Course. So a shout out to our viewers online and at home. We asked our class to complete some readings on today's topic and watch a couple videos, and you can access those at our website, at our course website. I'd like to thank both of you for being here for this interview. And
we have to.
We have no choice.
And without further ado, we're going to start out with a question that a number of different students asked in different forms, which is, can you guys talk to us about your work habits, procrastination, and how you deal with deadlines that are both externally imposed and external and self-imposed?
I have no procrastination problems.
None whatsoever.
Nothing.
Really?
No.
He's just a liar.
That's a different class.
Oh, right, that's next week.
You want to start?
Sure. I don't procrastinate things I like, but I do procrastinate things I don't like, which makes me human, right? I mean, that's kind of what the research shows. But I do have a lot of tricks. And we talked about some of those in the reading and on the blog, too. I like to set false deadlines for myself. I reward myself. On some things, I give myself data, like dieting. I use a Fitbit because it gives me data. I work with other people so that I use peers to help regulate and modulate my own bad tendencies. And then some things like blogging, which I do almost every day, it's a compulsion. And I don't really think I get any credit for not procrastinating. It's kind of an obsession.
So I think for me, probably the biggest efficiency killer I have is email. And I know this very well, and I have a very hard time doing it. I know that my morning hours are very productive, but coming to the office and not looking at email is very, very tough. Okay. So I often look at email, and then I have things to do, and I get this incredible satisfaction of erasing some. My inbox is thousands of emails long, but erasing a few of those emails give me a satisfaction as if I've accomplished something. This is called structured procrastination. You really procrastinate, you're not really doing anything useful, but you feel like you're making progress. And then my other big problem is that when I look at my calendar in the future, my future looks very empty. So if you ask me if I could do something tomorrow, do I have an extra 15 minutes or half an hour? Impossible. The next month is booked. You say, what about in a year from now? Oh my goodness, I have nothing but time. I look at my calendar, I'm not sure if I'll have anything to do. I'll be really bored. So I'm happy to take all kind of commitments in the future. And then the future becomes the present becomes incredibly busy, and I regret doing things. So those for me are the big issues. In terms of tricks, I have tried for a long time to schedule empty blocks for myself. So I schedule blocks and I say, okay, these are time for me to think. But the problem is there's a limit to how much you can fool yourself. So then I schedule things on top of that because it's not really this, and I'm just doing it. But by the way, one of the interesting problems with time, it's similar to the problem with money. One of the problems with money is opportunity cost. Every time you buy a cup of coffee, you're giving up something in the future. You're buying something now, you're giving up something in the future. Time is the same thing. Every time you accept something else to do now, you're giving up something in the future. The problem is it's not always clear what are you giving up. So imagine you did something extra now. You read an extra paper. It comes instead of something. It might be sleep, it might be exercise, it might be something else. But this trade-off is really unclear. Those are my big ones.
I do have one trick that my mentor in my first teaching job told me, which is to never read. At the time it was mail, not email, never read anything twice. And then it's better to answer something instantly the first time you read it and fast than to put it aside and think you're going to do it longer later, because it's horrible to have to go back through your inbox and find something and give a long answer. So that's my best single trick for email.
From that perspective, I think that people who keep a to-do list in their inbox in email is just terrible, because you keep on going back to email. You've left 3 times. I still don't want to deal with this now, so I'll delay it for later. And then later you say, oh, I still don't want, like you'll never want to deal with it.
Right. I'm still an awful human being, right?
So are there differences between when it's you, you're writing a book and you're saying, I'm going to get these chapters done by these times? Is there differences between when it's your own deadline versus, the editor of the paper calling for your review at a certain time? Is it harder when it's your own, and how does that management work differently?
It's not harder when it's my own, but there's kind of not a tapping foot. There's nobody telling me to do it, so it probably takes a little more self-control, but typically it's also something I love more. Yeah. So it takes more self-control, but since I love it more, it takes less self-control. So it balances out.
Yeah, for me, I would say that self-imposed deadline, particularly if they're public and if they're written, are relatively effective for me.
All right. Well, moving on. So Jamie Holmes, in the assigned article in the New Republic, mentioned a study that proposes that our self-control is depletable. Similarly, Barack Obama told Michael Lewis in a recent Vanity Fair that his decision-making power is limited, and he automates simple decisions like what he's wearing, food he's eating, so that he can conserve those energies. Can you talk about that concept and the idea that we have self-control tanks, and how, either by automating recurring self-control challenges or, other ways that we can help sort of expand, conserve our willpower for when we need it most and expand it?
The simplest one, and this plays off what you said about President Obama. Last year I was on a book tour and gave about 70 talks and consultings and other things during the course of the year. And for that I left out a suitcase with certain things always in the suitcase, and certain things I wore. If you look at the videos, there's some similarity from one time to another. And I would take them home, get them cleaned, and put them back in the suitcase. And that kind of automated a very simple part of the process that I hate. I hate packing. So I automated that so I could then concentrate on what I really needed to do, which was to deliver something fresh and vibrant and relevant to the particular audience I was talking to. So I tend not to have canned talks. I try to really focus on the problem of the audience that's invited me and really address those. So automating something I don't like, the simple part of the packing, helped me, be more responsive to the actual situation I was in.
So this notion of self-control being a limited resources and a resource that could be depleted is actually very, I think, central and important. And the idea is that what Rob Baumeister have shown over a long time is that self-control, you can think of it like a muscle. You resist a cookie, you resist a muffin, you resist YouTube, you resist. At some point you're just tired, and if temptation comes at that point, there's a good chance you'll succumb to temptation. And you could say maybe this is the reason why the temptation industry is at night, right? We're basically trying to resist temptation all the day. We're ready to fail. The other part of it is to think about the psychology of the poor. So there's this very interesting analogy to think about the poor as having a small suitcase. So you're saying if you're rich, you have a big suitcase, you need to pack another sweater or something else, there's no problem. You just throw it in there, there's enough space. If you're poor, first of all, you don't have enough space for everything you want. And then if something else has to go in, something has to go out. And sometimes not only something has to go out, but you have to rearrange everything. Imagine everything was very tightly packed. And if you think about the life of the poor, it's very much like that. You want to buy a cup of coffee, something has to give. Like the trade-offs are everywhere, right? We avoid thinking about trade-offs. This opportunity cost is very, very difficult to think about. Saying, do I want the coffee or not? But imagine every time you were facing a decision about the coffee or a sandwich or something, it was also a question of what are you giving up? And that's incredibly depleting. It's something that would actually get you to be incredibly tired. if you had to think about it all the time. And there's some interesting papers showing that having a smaller budget that is limited is just inherently depleting. And therefore, you're saying, let's look at all the people who don't have the financial, a good financial situation. Why do they fall more to temptation? One interpretation is they just have no self-control. That's why they became poor. Another one is to say that if you're poor, everything you're doing is very tough, and therefore succumbing to self-control problems are much, much easier.
So Dan, your article mentioned the value of commitment devices, and the TED Talk by Daniel Goldstein gave the example of Odysseus strapping himself to the mast, so he will not give in to temptation by the Sirens. A more relevant example might be the apps and the websites that make you pay if you do not keep up with whatever commitment you make, goal you make. We've seen the value of these. Do you guys see limitations in these commitment devices? And do you think that there's ways to make self-control more intrinsic, as not, less gimmicky, I guess, would be one way to put it, and more sort of kind of day-to-day and fundamental?
Well, why don't you go first?
Okay. When I learned about this was Ulysses. When is it Ulysses and when is it Odysseus? Do we know? It's the same character.
Roman
right?
Greek.
But
right.
Roman and Greek, that's
right.
Okay. So if you think about Ulysses, there's actually two things in there, right? So Ulysses tied himself to the mast, so he could hear the sirens, but he could not follow them. And the sailors put wax in their ears. He asked them to put, so they could not even be tempted. And if you think about it, those are very two different approaches for self-control. One is you say, I'm going to create something now that will prevent my future self from acting on my temptation. The other one is saying, I'm going to do now that will basically not let me meet temptation. Now, these gimmicks of self-control, I think, are not just gimmicks. I mean, they have this kind of recognition of how fallible we are, which I think is what kind of disturbs us, right? We would like to be the kind of people who could just get cookies, put them at home, and say, I'm going to have one every 3 days. Right? But we're not these people. So when we engage in these tricks, we actually recognize that we're not these people. We're not the people that we would like to be, but can we become those people? And I think the answer is basically no. It's kind of a sad realization, but the answer is no. And if you think about it, the world is becoming more and more tempting. There was a very kind of sad analysis that looked at what is the percentage of people that die because of bad decision making. And they tried to estimate what was the percentage 100 years ago. They said 100 years ago, you said, when could people make a bad decision that would translate into death? It was about 10%, not one-to-one translation, but could contribute to dying. It was about 10%. You look at it now, it's slightly more than 40%. How come? As we invent new technologies, we also invent ways to kill ourselves. Smoking, diabetes, obesity, texting and driving. Think about it. All of those are things that every one decision is not going to kill us, but we're tempted to do them time after time after time after time. And not only that, the commercial environment around us is all about tempting us to misbehave even more. Right? Think about it. What is the commercial environment around us about? Getting us to think about the long term, or getting us to do what's good for that industry right now? Is the goal of Facebook to make you more productive citizen 20 years from now? Or to check more frequently into Facebook today and tomorrow? Today and tomorrow. Is the goal of Dunkin' Donuts to get you to be healthy in 30 years or to eat another donut today? Is the goal of the smartphone to get you to check very infrequently or to check all the time? Right? One of the basic principles of behavioral economics is that we are an outcome of the environment in which we're being placed. And the environment in which we're being placed is an environment that tempts us all the time. So what are the chances we could just will ourselves over it? Maybe if you're the Dalai Lama, right? And that's what you do. You basically practice all the time to overcome temptation. But the rest of us, we're just going to fail and fail. So I think this gimmicky, maybe not, but this approach of using tricks to help us fight is incredibly important. And I know we're over time, but that's okay. There's a self-control issue there, maybe. One of the most important experiments in self-control was this experiment by Walter Mischel. And this was an experiment with the marshmallows, right? So Walter Mischel gave kids a little cookie or a marshmallow. They said, look kid, you can eat this one now, or you can wait for 10 minutes. And if you wait for 10 minutes, a nice lady will come with 2. Now the question is, could the kids wait or not? Some kids could, some kids couldn't. The kids who could wait actually had better performance in college. And then we read about some other aspects of improved performance in the other papers. But what's interesting is when you look at these kids, you can say, are these kids that just have better self-control, or are these kids that have tricks? And what you see is the kids are sitting on their hands. You see kids looking up, you see kids singing to themselves. These are kids that were basically able to create tricks for themselves. And college is all about overcoming temptation, right? I mean, there's no question about it. There's lots of things that are interesting happening around you, and you have to control yourself to do homework, come to classes. I mean, I don't think there's any class that is going to be always better than on the social thing you could do at that moment. So there's really lots of self-control problem, but I think the insight, it's these tricks we can play on ourselves, right? What would happen if you sat on your hands? And you can probably look at your daily life and you say, what are the things that you do to be slightly more accountable? For example, do you go and study in the library instead of in your dorm room? Your dorm room is probably more quiet, but there's also a bed. And you can also have YouTube. I mean, think about all the things that you do to basically sit on your hands so you can't follow your selfish temptations.
A couple things. One, I think college is kind of amazing in that it's the border from the time when you have parents controlling you to an adult life on the other side of this where there's, it's completely about how you manage to exercise control. College is kind of a liminal space in between those. So a former boss of mine used to say people pay a lot of money for their kids to go to college, to go from being kids to being adults. And part of that adults is figuring out what are those things that we as human beings need to help ourselves sit on our hands so we don't eat the other marshmallow. The other thing is, since we're also reading literature in this class, it's interesting to me how certain perennial classics in literature deal with these basic human problems. I mean, like we still talk about Ulysses being tied to the mast. Why? Because in ancient Greece and in the present, we're still worrying about how we get over temptation and what kinds of things we can do, what kinds of practices we can do to keep us from temptation, because we know temptation, if it's the sirens, will kill us. The study that you're talking about in terms of how often we die from bad decisions, those are the sirens of our own time. I mean, I agree too, the whole point of consumer capitalism is to give us lots of temptations all the time. In the literature we read in the Juno Dias, it wasn't buying things, but sexuality. And I think one of the things that makes that story that's part of This Is How You Lost Her is the sadness. He goes year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and he's still missing her. And it ends with that beautiful line where he says the half-life of love is forever. Meaning his whole life, he's going to realize he blew it, right? He was unfaithful. He messed up. His girlfriend showed him what it cost her by taking all of those emails and photos and putting them in a book and saying to him, okay, make this your next novel. Well, what she was really saying is, this is the evidence, right? I have documented all the times you didn't have control. And my revenge is you're never going to forget me. She doesn't have to say that. He has the documentation of how he messed up. And the power of that, I think, and that's one of the reasons I think we like literature and that we empathize with literature and we remember literature, is emotionally it's pretty gripping to see how somebody else's short-term indulgence led to what clearly is going to be a loss that lasts a whole lifetime. And empathy is partly about seeing that and being able to imagine more clearly what the consequences would be. Right? Those little kids sitting on their hands, maybe another part would be, another version of that would be to show, let them see a video of kids where some of the kids get the 2 marshmallows versus some that don't. It might actually change. And that's what the video we saw did, where there was the virtual reality, where you actually got to see in virtual reality a progression of yourself into the future. It's basically what Juno Dias is doing by saying the half-life of love is forever. It's saying this is you projected into the future, and you're still going to feel lost. You're 5, you're 6, you're 7, you're 8, right? We all have those things that we regret the rest of our lives because of our lack of self-control. Sometimes having those models emotionally, and I think that's the part about literature that's important. It doesn't just grip us intellectually. We can be pretty bad about ideas. It makes us feel something and think of something we can't get out of our heads, and that's a great way to learn a kind of lesson that we can apply in our own lives. Maybe learn to sit on our hands or the equivalent for Juno Dias.
So I actually have a question. So, you know, when we teach in a university with people sitting in a class, we do a lot to help the students not procrastinate. We have deadlines, we have exams, we have papers due, we schedule things. People have to show up and so on. You know, the times are fixed, you have a schedule. And when people do online courses, we lose all these babysitting functions.
Yes.
Actually, also community colleges.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
community colleges are very non-successful because of this, and online classes. So what do you think is the future of online classes if they don't provide all of these babysitting tools to help procrastination? And can you do something about it?
Yeah, that's great, because this is a topic I'm very much involved with. I don't know if you know, the retention rate of students at Duke is way over 90%. The dropout rate of most of the online, massive online courses offered by places like Duke is 90%. Right? That's pretty graphic. So we all who are working in online education know we have to come up with some methods of keeping people interested. Probably peer group is one. Possibly short. One of the things I think is very important, why does a class have to be 12 weeks? Right? That's a convention of face-to-face education. Maybe the way we need online education, the next iteration of online education will be the way you watch a YouTube video. Maybe a slightly longer version of that, where you don't take a whole course, but you take units that are designed and know that there's some kind of attention that has to be captured. And the content at the end of it might be testable, but not in terms of a whole class, but in terms of taking the test many, many times and learning more bits of information as we go along. We're experimenting with that. There's also some evidence that classes that are sage on the stage, lecturing out to the audience, have a higher dropout rate. What we're doing has a higher dropout rate than problem-oriented, problem-based ones.
It's even worse.
Right. With 2 people, it's a disaster. No one's going to watch this video. And the best rate we've seen so far is games, because in games you're constantly playing against yourself and you're leveling up, right? And the trick about a game is that when you do well, it doesn't reward you. It makes a harder game. So you have to learn even more and do even more. So my guess is the future of online education will be much more game-based. And the people I'm working with on online education are, in fact, figuring out ways that the power of games and the competitive and self-competitive power of games can be harnessed with education, especially in math. It works great with math games.
Okay, so Kathy, transitioning back to what you were talking about with...
Did you see he started with professor, then he moved to...
I know, it's how, it's how fast it happens.
I was going to ask you guys, but just went with it. You're talking about college and as a transition time from having the parental controls to not. One of the students posited that authoritarian parenting might help better develop self-control later in life. Conversely, it might be that the kid who has a parent who's always telling him to do his work, do his chores, eat his vegetable, when he's in the environment without this control, he finds it hard to self-regulate. Can you discuss the connection between parenting and self-control? And I'm not sure if you guys have children, but if you want to talk about some of your own, parenting tactics or your own upbringings.
Well, we of course are perfect parents. I mean, there's no question about that. I don't think I could presume to say what the best way is, but I don't believe you can be completely authoritarian and then think when your child is going to go out there in the world, that break between the 17-year-old who has every rule and the 18-year-old who suddenly parents have no legal authority over them, that they're suddenly going to be perfect. And I think there has to be some graduated assignment of self-control to the, you can't go from complete control by a parent to complete self-control. There have to be ways in which responsibilities are delegated to the child, so the child more and more becomes an adult, becomes somebody who can exercise judgment for themselves.
So at some point, somebody from PBS came to my house to talk about self-control. And my kids were playing, and they asked me to give them a self-control task. So our son, Amit, he was 9 at the time, now he's 10. I said, okay, what would you rather have? Would you rather play for 10 minutes now and then go and clean your room? Or go to clean your room now and then come back and play for 20 minutes? And he said, I'll go now, and then, so kind of delayed gratification. I said, okay, go. Then our daughter, who was 5, I said, what would you rather do? Would you rather play now 10 minutes and then do something, or do something now and then play for longer? And she gave the same answer. She said, I'll go and clean the room or do something now and then I'll play for longer. I said, go. Okay, go and do it. She said, no. So she was at the exact point where she knew what she should say, but didn't feel like doing it. And if you want the clips, let me know. I'll give them to you. I think that the question about the parenting style and its success, I think, has to do with whether something can become intrinsically motivated or not, and whether something becomes a habit. So imagine. I'll give you an example. I hear people tell me that if you run for 6 weeks, you start craving running. I could never make it to 6 weeks, but people who do it for 6 weeks say that you start craving it. Now, if that's the world, then you can be authoritarian for 6 weeks and then you can let go because the internal desire starts up. Now, think about all kinds of things that kids do and ask yourself what kind of things could be acquired taste that at some point the kids enjoy doing. So I suspect that, you have to learn to like broccoli. Nobody is born loving broccoli. But if you connect it to a kid with good thing, after a while and so on, they might start developing a taste for broccoli. By the way, the same thing goes for wine, right? You go to young kids and you give them wine, it's impossible. They wouldn't drink wine. But if you teach them over time that it's good to have wine and so on, they would like it. So there are some things that if you're authoritarian, it basically means you force people, and then if their own internal mechanism kick afterward, that would work. There are some things that people hate all the time, and then it could have the opposite. Right. And then when you stop, all of a sudden there's a release. So I think we need to think about, can we make something into intrinsic, and then it's okay? And if we can't, we should try and convince people to do it, kids to do it, on their own accord, rather than suppress them to doing it, because otherwise it will backfire.
Okay, so this is from another one of the student posters. Have you considered situations where self-control would be a positive rather than a negative, aside from kind of a personal growth or learning from your mistakes after the fact?
You mean lack of self-control?
I'm sorry, yes, did I say, not having self-control would be a positive.
Yeah, no, I think that's what alcohol is for. The reality is that we all, we have a public image and we have who we think we should be. And there's lots of things about wanting to be of a certain type. And I think people go to parties and to drink in order to be the kind of people they want to be. Now, you might not want to be that person all the time, but from time to time, you want to reduce your inhibition. You want to be somebody more free that can say what they want, act on their impulses and so on, and that's very helpful. That's, by the way, why if you're going to a party and one person doesn't drink, like they spoil it for everybody. But you don't have this coordinated effort of, okay, we're all going to be different, we're going to blame it on alcohol, it will not be really us, it will be something different. I have some more R-rated analogy, but I'll let you.
Yeah, mine's a very PG-rated analogy. I tend to be a workaholic, and I don't do this very much anymore. It's a good reminder. But I used to go fishing with a bunch of fishing buddies in the Alberta mountains for at least a month every summer. And it would be riding horseback, sometimes camping out, sometimes coming home and going the next morning, fishing in beaver dams where there were grizzly bears and mountain lions, and it was such a crazy, different environment. I never once thought about my research, my works, but it was really sort of a fake situation. It's pretty neurotic, actually, when you think about it. You have to sort of live among the grizzlies in order not to think about your work life. But it's kind of like alcohol in the sense that you put yourself in an environment. I would put myself in an environment where it required such intensity to think about that environment that other environments disappeared and other things disappeared. And alcohol is basically that, right? You're using your own biology and the alcohol to do it, but you're in an environment where you can't think about the everyday pressures of work. You're creating a bubble around yourself where there's no way you can think about work. And I think that's, for me, that was what going out into nature was. Unfortunately, I stopped fishing, so I don't have quite that thing anymore. I started empathizing with the fish, darn it. so I don't have that. But I think I need it. As I'm talking, I'm realizing I really need to do that again.
Okay, another question from student blog posters. How does witnessing the experiences of others influence our own trade-off decisions? Are we more likely to exert willpower if we witness the consequences of a peer's lack of self-control? Might that self-control inspire? Might that lack of self-control inspire a lack of self-control in us? Can you guys discuss that a little bit?
So I would suspect that in a social environment, lack of self-control on one party would create lack of self-control in everybody else. So think about how riots are created, right? You can have, I mean, even look at the Arab Spring in Egypt. We had the situation that for a very long time was incredibly calm and surprisingly calm. And then you can ask yourself, is it really calm? Or could there be tiny effects out there that would have flipped it completely? And there were, right? There was some incredibly violent aspect, and now we see more violence coming out. And when you think about the crowd actually has the easiest time to observe the people who are going against the grain. So imagine you're in a big stadium for football, and one person starts acting crazy, right? He's incredibly salient, everybody sees them, and all of a sudden lots of other people start doing all kinds of things as well. The same thing can happen. So I think when we are mob behavior suggests that when we see other people misbehaving or behaving in a wild way, it will be easy for us to follow. I think there's also the other side. So if I'm not wishing this on anybody, but if you had a friend who texted and drove at the same time and got into an accident, there's a good chance that you will behave better, but not for very long, right? So the saliency of the consequences of self-control are likely to be salient in your mind. The problem is that most of the self-control problems are not like texting and driving. It's not that you do something bad and have a big consequence. Most of them are much more like overeating, where you do small things over time and it takes a long, long time for the consequences to be bad. But in the cases where you see the downside, if it's a good friend, there's a good chance it will stay with you, but not for long enough.
And I'm going to do two sides of that as well. There's certain kinds of things that we can exert enormous self-control if we're in a group of self-control. I don't know if any of you have ever done meditation, for example. When I lived in Japan, I lived at the foot of a very famous temple. And I used to go up and do zazen, which is a kind of Buddhist meditation with the monks. I would come back down the mountain and be convinced I could do this in my bedroom. It never worked. It just didn't work. But when I was sitting around people wearing these beautiful saffron robes in a 10th century temple, and they were chanting, and there was incense, I could sit in this uncomfortable position for 3 hours, and it was moving, it was spiritual, it was deep, but I found it impossible to do that on my own. And I bet everybody has situations where a good crowd behavior can also help modulate your behavior. There's a literary example, and I can't remember. We'll have to Google it and find out what this is from. I think it's from one of the hard-boiled detective novels, maybe Raymond Chandler, where he tells this story of somebody who's walking down the street and this beam falls and almost kills him, just falls right in front of him and almost kills him. And that makes him think about the shortness of life and that life is precious. And he goes home. He's been unhappily married. He ends his marriage. He moves. He changes his job. Everything happens. And about 5 years later, the detective, the narrator of this novel, runs into this guy on a street in a different city. He's married to a woman that looks just like his first wife. He's back in a profession exactly like his old profession. And the narrator says, and I think this is 20 years ago that I read this, but I think it's a pretty close quote. He adjusted himself to beams falling, and then no more of them fell. So he adjusted himself to beams not falling. And there is something about the patterns we have, where when we think there's something cataclysmic in our lives, we want to change our behavior. We think external circumstances will allow us to change our character. And then sometimes we lapse and go right back to the person we were before. I think there's a positive and a negative side to that in terms of the consistency of character. But that was a hard-boiled detective novel, so it was put in a rather cynical way, but kind of unforgettable too.
Okay, so a little more personal here. So what are the things you guys struggle with controlling? And you know, as self-aware people who devote yourself to the study of topics like this, you know, why are some of the devices that work elsewhere failing here?
You go first. So I wrote about this, but this was my biggest insight about self-control was. When I was a PhD student here, and when I was a student, I discovered I had hepatitis C. It was a disease I contracted in hospital many years earlier from a bad blood transfusion, but they finally identified what I had, and there was a study conducted here to see whether a medication called interferon is going to be effective for hepatitis C. Interferon was originally approved for hairy cell leukemia, and then once they approved something, they tried to see what else it could cover. And the problem was that the medication was very unpleasant. I had to inject myself, and every time I inject myself, I was sick basically for the whole night. Vomiting, headache, shaking, fever. Not as bad as dying from liver cirrhosis, but for sure and now. And I had to give myself 3 injections a week for a year and a half. So the question was, you know, how do I stomach that? And I did this. I beat the disease, by the way. Interferon was approved. There's better medications out there now, better versions of interferon. But what I did was every morning on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I would rent a few videos I wanted to watch. I would carry them in my backpack looking forward to seeing them. I would come home, I would put the video in, I would press play. I didn't wait for the side effects to start and then press play. I connected the injection with something good. And this is a principle we call reward substitution. You should say, we should just care about the liver, right? Me and all the other patients should have cared about our livers. The problem is that we are not designed to care about something in the long term. So what did I do? Instead of caring about the liver, I started caring about movies. Now, movies are not as important as the liver, right? If you ask me, what would you rather give up, movies or your liver? There's no question. But the movies were right now. And by the way, I was the only patient in this protocol who took the medication on time. I think it's because I re-engineered my environment to do this. And I think this has lots of applications. Right? It has basically ask yourself, what would cause me to behave well? What would cause me to behave well in terms of health? What would cause me to behave well in terms of the planet, in terms of driving, in terms of studying, all of those things? What would I do? I think reward substitution is one of those things, which is you say, I'm going to be nice to my liver, not because I'm going to wake up and think liver, because I'm going to wake up and think movies. I'm going to do something good for the planet, not because I think the planet needs my savings, but because I get these interesting light bulbs that change colors and I enjoy playing with them. So I'm very much interested in this kind of bringing the future into now and focusing on now, and therefore behaving nice for the future, but even without thinking about the future. So that for me was the biggest insight in terms of self-control, and I'm spending some of my time trying to think about what mechanisms like this we can create for other things. for me, the biggest problems I have with self-control are probably exercising, which for the last 5 years I've traveled so much, and when you spend a night in a hotel, it's just incredibly non-conducive. So getting into a habit of doing anything has been very tough. The same thing goes for eating, right? Habits are incredibly useful, right? You get used to something. And the other thing that I have, so exercising is particularly bad for me, but the other thing that I have really bad is, for me, every research project is an adventure. And when people call me or want to talk about something, or we have an idea, I have a very hard time saying, you know what, this is a really interesting idea, but I don't have time to be part of this research project. Like the temptation to try different things is so hard that I basically pre-commit to way too many things. And then I'm late on everything and everybody makes me feel guilty and then I don't have time to exercise. No, it feeds on this. But I think those two together, it's the inability to pass on an adventure and not thinking about the cost and then exercising.
So I'm going to end on a light note because I've read that story before about the interferon, and it's one of the reasons that I actually aggressively asked Dan to do this class, because I found that, one, it was profound, and two, I love the way Dan takes things that have happened to him or his research and helps us all with things that we can use in our everyday life. I think it's a very rare researcher who does that, and oh, look at this. I'm full of admiration. So I'm going to end it funny. Because it's really embarrassing that I'm feeling so much of admiration for a colleague who does this with his research. So I have a real problem with having a sweet tooth. And I can resist many things. I cannot resist caramel. I mean, I'm sure I could resist heroin more easily than I can resist caramel. I can't resist it. If it's around, if there's 5 of them and I want to eat one, I'll eat all 5. Beautiful, expensive, fabulous, rich chocolate I have in my cupboard at all times, and I have 2 little pieces after dinner. I feel proud of myself. Can have those 2 pieces. If it's caramel, it's gone. I mean, I once was in a parking lot of a wonderful Mexican supermarket that had a whole thing of Mexican caramel, and I bought 2 bags. One for myself to eat now, and one to bring back to share with my husband. Okay. I got to the car. I called my husband on the cell phone. I was so excited. I said, look, I've just had the best caramel ever, and I have a whole bag for both of us. And I looked down, and I said, oh, I must have forgotten it, because I've got 2 empty bags. I didn't even know I'd eaten the 2 caramels. So my way of dealing with it is I never put caramel in never bring caramel into my house. And if someone gives me caramel, I give it away immediately, unless I want to eat it all at once. So that's how I do it. I either have to totally indulge it, or I banish it. And I bet there's something, I bet we could go around this room and everybody would have that one thing. We certainly know from Gino Dias what his one thing is, right? And we have probably all have that one thing that or maybe more than one thing, that we know we have to put out of our lives because we're not going to control it. I've spent my whole life trying to control the caramel thing. It's not going to happen. So I make sure that I know that about myself and control it by either totally abstaining or just having a blast and enjoying it.
You know, Warren Buffett, in his biography, also has a sweet tooth. He actually likes sweet and fatty. So also pizzas and donuts. So what he did was he wrote his kids checks for $10,000, but he didn't sign them. And he told his kids that if they ever find him eating something sweet, he would sign the check for them. And he hates giving money to his kids, right? So this was his self-control mechanism. Now, of course, what did his kids do? Started putting donuts and pizzas around the house. But at least his report is that he didn't like giving the money so much that it helped.
I actually did that to myself once and had a cause that I despised and had a check for that cause, and if I couldn't, that despised charity got my money. Right. Well, the happy ending is next class. We're going to talk about love, right? It'll be our Valentine's Day class, and that should be lots of fun. So thanks, everyone.